Hi everyone. So today in the audit chapter, we will be continuing our next further chapter, and today we will be understanding how we use the work of others. So by others we mean internal auditor, specialists and other team members. So to begin with, we will discuss the internal auditor that is present in the team of the management and how can we as the external auditor can use the work of the internal auditor for our audit. So let's understand that. External auditor has the sole responsibility for the audit opinion. So external auditor is not influenced by the internal auditor's report or anything, and he or she has the sole responsibility for giving the opinion on the statutory audit, and that responsibility is not reduced by the external auditors use of the work of the internal auditors. So the work is not reduced of the external auditors. They have the certain criteria on which they can rely on the internal auditor work, but still they have to do their own part and they have to complete the audit in their own accountability. That is, even if using the work of internal auditor, external auditor cannot share the audit responsibility with the internal auditors. Although the internal audit function may have the objectivity and perform audit procedures similar to those performed by the external auditor, the internal auditor function or internal auditors are not independent of the entity as is required by the external auditor in the as per the GAI. So internal auditor can be the entity management personnel or anyone appointed by the parties by the management, and they should not be, it is not mandatory for the internal auditor to be independent, like they can have the dependency on the company that they are working for. But for the external auditor it is mandatory to maintain the independence throughout the audit so that they can audit the entity. Even if the work assistance of the internal auditor is used, the external auditor should continue to make all the significant judgment through the audit engagement. Consideration is in evaluating the internal audit functions before using the work or assistance. So, firstly, the level of competence, knowledge, and skills to perform the task diligently. That depends on the education, experience, technical training, and professional certifications. Also, the internal audit function should be adequately staffed depending on the size, nature, and of the entity. So, they should be competent enough. The internal auditor should be competent enough to perform the audit. Also, the level of objectivity, ability to perform the task without bias, conflict of the interest, undue influence. That depends on whether internal audit functions, organizational status, and relevant entity policy and procedures support the objectivity of the internal auditors. Internal audit function is free from any conflict responsibilities. TCWG oversees employment decisions for the internal auditors, and any constraints or restrictions placed on the internal audit functions by the management or TCWG. And internal auditors hold the professional membership relevant to the professional standards. So they should be objective throughout the audit, and generally higher the level of the internal auditor reports to, higher the level of objectivity can be assessed. For example, maximum objectivity if reporting to the audit committee, auditor will be objectively provide information even if the management intends to conceal. Approach of the internal audit function if systematic and disciplined. So use of the adequately documented internal audit procedures or guidance covering such areas as risk assessment, work programs, documentations, and reporting. Whether the internal audit function has appropriately quality control policies and procedures. So what is the approach that internal auditor is performing for their audit? That should be understood. If appropriate, the external auditor may use the work of the internal auditors to modify or the reduce the annuity of the audit procedures to be performed by the external auditors. So auditor may only is the may, not the mandatory or should use. It's totally depend on the external auditors. So depending on the certain circumstances, external auditors can use the work of the internal auditors. So using the work of internal audit function to obtain audit evidence, using the internal auditors to provide direct assistance. So either that can be used as the audit evidence or to get the assistance from the internal auditors. Uh, so So further to drill down on this, using the work of the internal audit function to obtain the audit evidence. Now we will be seeing this, understanding this from the external auditor's perspective. So evaluating the internal audit function. Auditor, the level of the competence and objectivity the approach of the function is systematic and disciplined, including quality control. To determine the nature and extent of the work of the internal audit function that can be used. So external auditor should consider the entity of the work performed or is planned to perform by the internal audit function and its relevance to the external auditor's overall audit strategy and audit plan. The test of the controls that addresses RMM related to the completeness of the AP substantive test where internal auditors have confirmed the certain AR and observed certain physical inventories, procedures related to the finance information of the competence of the entity. So these are the things where entity can be considered while using the work of the internal auditor. Also, auditor should make all the significant judgments through the audit, including when using the work of the internal audit functions. Auditor should use the less work of the internal audit function and perform more of the work directly if more judgment is involved, high RMM assessed at the assertion level, or less competence and the objectivity of the internal auditors are there. Also, auditor should evaluate if in aggregate, using the work of internal auditor would result in the external auditor still being sufficiently involved in the audit, giving the external auditor sole responsibility for the audit opinion. So external auditor should not too much rely on the internal audit functions and should take accountability of their work on their own and can't say that this task was performed by the internal auditor so they have use the less extent given the less timing on this procedure, so that is not the valid reason to minimize the extent or timing of the work. Communication with the TCWG. External auditor should communicate to TCWG and how the external auditor plans to use the work of internal audit function to obtain the audit evidence. Using the work of internal audit function in obtaining the audit evidence, external auditors should discuss the planned use of the work with the function as the basis for coordinating their activities, read the related reports of the internal audit function to obtain understanding of the nature and extent of the audit procedures, perform the sufficient audit procedures on the work of the internal audit function that the external auditor plans to use determine the adequacy for the purpose of the audit. Also, evaluate whether work was properly planned, performed, supervised, reviewed, and documented. Sufficient appropriate evidence was obtained to enable the reasonable conclusion reached are appropriate in the circumstances. They perform some of the work, inquiries of the appropriate individual, inspections and observations. These are the audit functions that auditor should perform, even if there is the internal audit work and they have taken the support from the internal audit work. The external auditor should perform these procedures. Determine whether it is appropriate to use the work of the internal audit function to modify the nature, timing, or reduce the extent of further audit procedures directly by the external auditor. So the extent or timing can be reduced depending on the quality of work that has been done by the internal auditor. But again, the conclusion here is that external auditors should not completely rely and use their own competence to analyze the work of the internal auditor, that can be relied or not, that can be documented or not, and that can be taken as a basis or not. At the last, external auditor will themselves be accountable for their opinion on the financial statement, and they can't conclude or they can't say that because this was performed by the internal auditor we have relied on this. It's the responsibility of the external auditor to take accountability, to understand the uh, nature of the work and to understand the level of the competence of the internal auditors while using their work and relying on their work. Using the internal auditor to provide the direct assistance under the direction, supervision, and review of the external auditor. So, evaluating the internal auditors, level of the competence and objectivity should be evaluated, determine the nature and extent of the work that can be assigned to the internal auditors. So, external auditors should be careful to limit such work to those areas that would be appropriate for the internal auditors to provide the direct assistance. For example, inquiries of the entity personnel or the TCWG to identify the fraud risk or determine the unpredictable audit procedures. Also, auditor should make all the significant judgments throughout the audit, including when using the work of the internal audit function, use the list of the direct assistance from the internal auditors. If more judgment is involved, high RMM assist at the assertion level, and less competence and or objectivity of the internal auditors are there. Also, auditors should evaluate if, in aggregate, using the work of the internal auditors would result in the external auditor still being sufficiently involved in the audit or not. Talking about the communication with TCWG, external auditor should communicate to TCWG on how the external auditor plans to use the internal auditor to provide the direct assistance. Also, using the internal auditors to provide the direct assistance, external auditor should obtain the written acknowledgement representation from the management TCWG that internal auditor provide the direct assistance to the external auditor will be allowed to follow the external auditor's instructions and that the entity will not intervene in the work of the internal auditor performed for the external auditor. Also, auditor may specifically instruct the internal auditors to keep the confidential specific matters and to inform the external auditor to any threat of their objectivity. In some cases, the external auditor may even request written acknowledgement from the internal auditors of having understood such instructions by the external auditor. Also, the auditor should direct, supervise, and review the work performed by the internal auditors on the engagement because since the internal auditors are not independent, external auditors' involvement may need to be more extensive than if the members of the audit engagement team perform the work. Entity of the direction, supervision, and the review should be responsive to the outcome of the evaluation of the factors, including the amount of the judgment. External auditor should instruct the internal auditors to bring the accounting and auditing issues or review the procedure should include the external auditor testing some of the work performed by the internal auditors. And external auditor should remain alert for the identification of the relating to the competence or objective of the internal auditor. So this was all about using the work of the internal auditor in our audit by the external auditor. So these points should be considered by the external auditor while determining the anity of their work while using the internal auditor's work and to rely on the work performed by them. So this was all about the internal auditor. And now in the next chapter, in the next session, we will talk about the using the work of others as a specialist. Like if the specialists are involved, how can we rely on their work? So let me know if you have any questions on the internal auditor. I will really help out you to resolve those. Thank you and bye.